Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode I call 3 Incredible Cases of Kids Contacting UFO Craft. Many people don't know it, but children comprise a large majority of UFO witnesses. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that children spend a lot more time outside than do adults. Children also are less shy about reporting their encounters. They have little fear of being, disbelieved or ridiculed. They're very open. And another reason I'm speculating is that ETs enjoy contacting children. Many people who are contactees do report that their encounters started at a very young age. So I think there are a number of reasons why there are so many children who are UFO witnesses. And that's why I wanted to do this episode today, because children are often disbelieved and not taken seriously, when in fact they are far more likely than most people to see a UFO. And I've chosen 3 cases, again, that I want to present to you today, and these are not simple sightings. These are quite extensive encounters. Under the J. Allen Hynek system, they would be classified as close encounters of the second or third kind. Each of these cases does involve multiple witnesses. Each involves various effects, such as landing traces, electromagnetic effects, physiological effects, animal reactions, and so forth. So these are all quite well verified and really unusual. And I don't know if you've heard of them or not, because there's a few, at least 2 of them, which are somewhat well known. But I'm guessing you probably have not heard of these before. At any rate, they are very unusual and interesting, and I think have a lot to say about the nature of the UFO phenomenon. So let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about, I call Case 1, the CASA BLANCA encounter. This is a very interesting case involving a group of about 8 children and at least a couple of adults. It took place in the Casa Blanca area of Riverside, California. This is in Southern California. And it took place over a period of about 2 hours, from 2 to 3 p.m. in the afternoon on the day of August 22nd, 1955. And this was investigated by major investigators such as Idabel Epperson and Ted Blocher and others. And it really caused a near riot following this event. I mean, it was quite a amazing encounter and was actually published in the local newspaper. So let's just get started. So again, this case occurred on August 22nd, 1955. It was around 2 p.m. in the afternoon when a group of about 8 children, ranging in age from 4 to 5 years old all the way up to 14 years old, were playing in the backyard of Mr. and Mrs. Douglas of Casa Blanca in Riverside, California. We actually know the exact address of this location. And how this all began was when one of the boys, Ronnie Strickland, had climbed onto the roof, and he noticed a roof of one of the houses and noticed a spinning silver disc hovering overhead. And as he and the other children looked up, this disc-like object disappeared and began to reappear several times. And this is when they noticed that there were more than one object in the sky. There were several orb-like objects which kept appearing and disappearing, and they were of different shapes, and each time they would make these weird sort of musical pinging noises. So the children became quite excited, and at this point one of these objects swooped down and actually landed in a field next to the house. One of the witnesses said it was, quote, about as large as 3 houses put together, and as he says, it was very beautiful and colorful. And at this point, a humanoid being actually exited this craft, and one of the witnesses was a child by the name of Kermit Douglas, and he said, and I quote, a little man came out. He said it was about 3.5 feet tall, and as he says, it had, quote, big red eyes, a big red mouth, and 4 diamond-shaped things where his nose should be. So this little being got out of this craft and began to walk towards these boys. They said it was very short. They said about the size of a 4-year-old child. It wore a belt with a bright disc on top of it. One of the kids said it was sort of shadowy in appearance. And they said it had what appeared to be 4 arms. And in 2 of these arms it was holding these gun-like instruments. And at this point, this spaceman, if you will, pointed one of these objects at one of the kids by the name of Ronnie Strickland. And Ronnie suddenly felt himself being levitated. As he says, I just floated off into space from a housetop. And this was actually witnessed by one of the boy's mothers, who came running out and said that the boy turned bright red at this time. And the boy's friends also saw Ronnie float down off the rooftop and land on the ground. They came running to make sure he was all right, and he was. But at this point, this same figure pointed one of these other devices at 2 of the witnesses, rendering them temporarily paralyzed. One of the witnesses, Wayne Gardner, described this being as a, quote, man with a funny costume. Another one of the children, his name was Marvin Sims, described how these UFOs would appear and disappear, and he said, and I quote, that the spaceships sort of spiraled down, and when they took off, they pulled up off the ground and then disappeared with a whirling motion. So while one of these objects landed in the field and a humanoid exited, another seemed to land on the roof of one of the houses, and another right on top of a walnut tree, and actually broke off a branch. And this was going on for quite some time. The children were screaming. At least 2 adults came out, and they said they did not see anything, although they could see that the children were reacting. So that's a very strange feature of this case. A couple of the children said that they were being mentally beckoned to go inside of the craft. And one of them, who was 7 years old, fell into a trance and started to walk towards this craft. And he was saying out loud that it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. His friends became concerned and grabbed his arms and would not let him walk forward. Meanwhile, 2 other kids said that they were being told to climb a tree and wait to be picked up. They seemed to do this in a trance, and they climbed right up this tree, and the other kids tried to call them down and finally turned a hose on them, which convinced them to come back down. So at some point, this little man, quote, scurried back into the saucer, which took off and went away. But again, this went on for at least an hour. The kids were interviewed by reporters. Reporter Bob Roden wrote an article for the Riverside Enterprise newspaper. An artist was brought to the scene. Her name was Jean Rowland, and she did drawings of all these objects based on the kids' descriptions, and also drew the humanoid figure that these kids saw. At one point, one kid described how this disembodied like arm was beckoning at him. They all described the various shapes and these weird humanoids. And several adults were there at the time. Miss Maddie Johnson, her son was one of the witnesses. She verified the event and said that her son came running to her and nearly knocked her down. He was so frightened. And in fact, several of the kids were so frightened that they continued to cry for hours afterwards. Another one of the witnesses was Blanche Campbell. She was a neighbor, and she confirmed that all the kids reported this and were very much frightened. But the weird part about this is that 2 adults were present when this was going on, and the kids were pointing at the objects, and the adults could not see it. This does turn up in some UFO cases, so I don't know what exactly is going on here, but this does appear to be display for the children, or the children being contacted directly. Afterwards, the entire street was in a near riot, and reporters were called, and it did generate an article in the local newspaper, as I said. But what's very interesting about this case is there are 8 witnesses at least. There are landing traces in the form of the broken branch on the walnut tree, physiological effects. One of the boys, his skin turned bright red, and there were at least 2 kids reported being paralyzed, and kids receiving telepathic messages to approach the craft or wait to be taken on board. There is no direct indication that this was, in fact, an onboard experience, but it could have led to one if the other kids had not restrained the kid who was walking towards one of these craft. So it's a very strange case, which was very well investigated, very well verified, and remains a classic in UFO history. So as you can see, that's a very well verified and very unusual event. But now let's move on to case 2, and I call case 2 Kids Buzzed by a UFO. This again is a multiple witness case. It involves more than just the 2 children. This took place in Victorville, California on the evening of February 24th, 1959. This case was investigated by Project Blue Book, which was not able to explain it. This is case number 1140, which was labeled unidentified. And this is a very unusual case involving animal effects, electromagnetic effects, and a very unusual type of behavior from these UFOs. And how this all began was on the evening again of February 24th, 1959. So this case took place in Victorville, and what's really interesting is this was 8 miles away from George Air Force Base, directly south, 8 miles away. So this was of great interest to Project Blue Book intelligence officers. And how this all began was on the evening of February 24th, again in 1959, and the main witness is an anonymous high school student who was described by the investigating Air Force intelligence officer as an average young man of average intelligence, liked by his schoolmate and teachers. And the main investigator for this case was Officer Rudolph Pestalozzi. And what's interesting about that is Rudolph Pestalozzi was himself a UFO witness. He had seen UFOs earlier in Arizona near Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, and he was apparently a contactee because he would later write a book called Letters to You from Ballaran about his telepathic communications with ETs. So he was the main investigating officer, and according to Rudolph Pestalozzi, the main witness, the high school student, was babysitting his younger brother, and the 2 of them were alone in the house. And they were just getting ready to go to bed at around 10 p.m. when he observed a, quote, bright, white, steady light that he said was much too intense to be a car. And at the same time, the family's pet dogs began to howl and run around in complete terror, begging to be let inside the house. So the high school student opened the front door, and he was shocked to see a 150-foot long egg-shaped object. He said it was dull red in color and had purple tinges around the edges and was emitting an intense white light. This object was only 100 feet away and was moving towards him at treetop level. And he realized with shock that it was coming directly for his house. In the space of about 10 seconds, this object approached until it was directly over the house, passing over the front yard at a height of only 10 feet. So this is very low. And at this point, the high school student could hear a sound which he described as, quote, similar to the hum of a transformer, but higher in pitch. The investigating officers asked him, could it possibly have been a sonic boom he heard? And the kid said, no, absolutely not. He's heard sonic booms many times. He's familiar with aircraft coming in and out of George Air Force Base. And he said that this was not at all like them. And in fact, he provided a description of this egg-shaped object. And the Blue Book officers actually drew this object based on the boy's description and drew what happened next, because as this object passed overhead, it seemed to disappear. But the encounter wasn't over yet. The witness returned inside to check on his younger brother and the dogs, and when he returned outside again, the object was back. And this time it was just west of his house and was again at approaching, even lower this time, at about a height of only 8 feet. So this terrified the boy. He dashed back inside. At the time, his parents were not in the house. They were at night school. And so he felt like he had to protect his younger brother and the house. And so he ran inside and retrieved the family gun, while his younger brother looked out the front window and observed this object, which was now hovering in place in front of the house. The high school student took the gun and went outside, and he saw this object hovering just west of the house, and at this point it started to approach him again at high speed. This scared him, so he dashed back into the house, and the two boys watched from the window as this object moved away, turned around, and came swooping down again directly over the house. And it did this again. 15 minutes later, the object returned, coming so low that the entire house vibrated. So this object was clearly putting on a show. It wanted to be noticed and was swooping over the house repeatedly. And the witnesses noticed that each time the object passed over the house, the radio, which was on, became completely blocked by, quote, intense static. And at the same time, they would hear this strange crackling noise coming from the craft. So the two boys were quite frightened, and they remained inside as this craft swooped over their house very low, a total of at least 5 times before it finally left. And their parents arrived home at around 11 p.m. By this point, the craft was gone for good. But they listened to the boys. They could tell that they were quite frightened, very sincere. And they did notice that both of their dogs were, quote, whimpering and shaking and hiding under the furniture. So they reported it, and this is when Blue Book officials arrived, and Rudolph Pestalozzi, the interrogating intelligence officer, said that the witness was, quote, sincere and did not change his story, although questioned several times on different points, and seemed generally convinced that what he saw actually exists. So again, they did drawings of what the boys saw and mapped out the trajectory of this craft based on the boys' eyewitness testimony. And they also did a further investigation and questioned the neighbors. And at least 2 of them confirmed this incident and said that they saw, quote, something, but they refused to elaborate. But they did admit that they both had severe radio and television interference at about that time. So, again, this took place very close to George Air Force Base, and this caused some concern among the intelligence officers. They were unable to explain it. This was a case that involved not only animal effects, but electromagnetic effects for at least 3 of the homes in this area. It's quite unusual for an object to come that low and repeatedly buzz a house over and over again. The interrogating officers from Project Blue Book were very impressed. So I can only imagine what that must have been like for these 2 boys. And again, Air Force intelligence officers were not able to explain this and labeled it unidentified, case number 1140. And now we move to the 3rd and final case, which is somewhat well known within the UFO community. And I call this case the Lemon Grove UFO landing. This was researched by prominent researchers such as Idabel Epperson, Donald Carr, who worked for APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, San Diego-based researcher Mel Podell also researched and verified this case. This case involves a UFO landing as witnessed by two boys, though there are outside witnesses as well. And this involves landing traces, which have yet to be fully explained. This is quite a remarkable and unusual case, as we shall see. This third case took place on a little dead-end street called Crane Street. And again, this is in Lemon Grove in Southern California. It was on November 16, 1973, when two 11-year-old boys, their names are Richard T. and Daniel F., their actual identities were withheld, but they claimed to have had a very unusual experience where they witnessed a landed UFO. It was around 6 p.m., they said, when the two boys were exploring the neighborhood around their home, and they were crossing over a vacant property surrounded by a chain link fence. They had just passed a clump of bamboo and were walking through this area with dried grass and hard clay ground. They walked into this field and got the shock of their life. And as I'll just read the report on this case, which was written by Isabel Epperson and Donald Carr of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. And as the report on this case says, and I quote, "After passing a clump of bamboo, they came out into the open and saw an object sitting in a darkened field. They slowly approached it, and after about 5 minutes, one boy, who had a flashlight in his hand, walked up to it and rapped on it 3 or 4 times with the flashlight. The object, which the boys described as dull gray, immediately came to life. The rapping had produced a metallic sound. A dome on top of the object, about as high as its diameter, became illuminated with intense red light which irradiated the entire area, including the boys. At the same time, the object, which had been about 18 inches off the ground, rose up to about 3 or 4 feet. A row of green lights around the peripheral rim of the object started to blink in sequence, and the object started to rotate, making a not very high-pitched sound. The rate of rotation became very high, with the red light blinking on and off. Then the red light went off momentarily, came back on, and the object rose into the air, still making the same sound." Now, the investigators did ask the boys to provide a drawing, and Richard T. provided 2 drawings where he illustrated exactly what this craft looked like and how they came right up to it and literally knocked on the door, so to speak. And as the report reads, I'm continuing what was written on this case, and I quote, "The boys started to run. They felt chills, tingly, and weak. They agreed that they felt as if they were going to black out and that they were running in slow motion. They said that the object took off towards the southwest, and they got up to the street and they saw it disappear into the clouds." This is a very important point because there was some confusion about how long this lasted, and the fact that they reported a distortion in time is something that does turn up in other cases. This was reported in the Rua, Zimbabwe landing case, where some of the kids felt like things were moving in actual slow motion. And there are a number of other cases like that where there's this weird time distortion effect. So I found that very interesting. So following this incident, the boys were interrogated in depth, and the investigators not only interviewed the boys, but their mothers as well. And everyone agreed that the boys were, in fact, telling the truth. They went and checked the field for landing traces, and Donald Carr did discover 3 holes forming a perfect equilateral triangle. And in the same area where this craft had nearly landed, the dead grass in the area was swirled in a counterclockwise circular pattern. Again, this ground was described as extremely hard, dry clay. So APRO did provide an investigator by the name of Walter Walker who analyzed the landing trace cases, though the results were not published as far as I know. But investigators didn't stop there. They started going house to house in this area asking the neighbors if they had experienced anything strange. And as it turns out, yes, they did. At least 5 neighbors reported intense and bizarre interference with their television sets. One of the residents on this street, Crane Street, her name is Catherine Chase, and she said this television interference occurred at precisely 7:20 p.m., which was confirmed by the other neighbors. So there again is some speculation about the possibility of missing time, though this was never confirmed. There was another kind of interesting aspect to this case when it was discovered that telephone service in this area had been impaired at the time and ultimately required 2 telephone lines to be replaced. They were fused together. One of the residents, her name is Judy Fergus, she lived on Crane Street, and she saw the landing traces and confirmed that the grass was all swirled together. This is also confirmed by researcher Mel Podell, who saw the landing traces, and he called it a great case. I agree. It's a case involving landing traces and EM effects and multiple witnesses, and has yet to this day to be explained. So those are the 3 cases I wanted to present to you today, and I think you'll agree they are quite striking, very unusual, very close-up encounters, and again, all involve kids. And what I like about these cases is every single one of them does have adult witnesses who verify it to some degree, in terms of experiencing electromagnetic effects or verifying the landing traces and so forth. I did cover these 3 cases in my book, UFOs over California, so if you'd like to learn more about them, you can certainly check that out. But again, I like these cases because kids do comprise a large majority of UFO witnesses, and often they're not believed and they're not taken seriously. And I think there's a message here that we should probably listen to our children when they come running inside and say that they're seeing a UFO. So that's our episode for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Once again, I want to thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Until next time, keep asking for questions, keep searching for answers, and most important, keep having fun.